Ever since we've been locked away, so to speak, Vanessa and I have had some more time to watch our favorite TV shows as if we're not already watching enough Netflix. One of them is Law and Order Special Victims Unit, and it's actually on Prime, just in case you want to know. It's kind of your typical cop show with all the twists and turns you can handle, enough to keep you guessing the whole time. You're always sort of wondering what's coming next. And the other day we watched an episode about a set of parents raising their teenage kid or their preteen child, and they're running into problems. And that sounds pretty normal. Anyone who's had kids knows that that's kind of every day almost. Well, their child, Henry, is in the process of transitioning to Haley. In other words, their child was physically born with the mind of a girl and is living in the body of a boy, but is now kind of living into a new reality of being both a girl in mind and body. Well, Haley, like every prepubescent kid, is volatile and intense and yelling and screaming at her parents. And not only that, but she's struggling to understand who she is with the cards that she's been dealt in life. Well, her mother had noticed at an early age that Haley was going through something that other kids just weren't. She was going through things that other kids were, but there was something else. And she tried to support her as best as she knew how, but the father, on the other hand, really wanted to have nothing to do with it. He could not and did not want to see what was happening. And so he carries around a picture in his pocket of himself and his son, Henry, as a reminder of who Haley once was, and his hope is will somehow be again. But it's obvious that Haley is not Henry and will never be Henry again. Haley likes boys, Haley dresses as a girl, Haley's connected with a group of trans youth where she finds safety and acceptance, as opposed to at school where she's simply mocked and bullied and harassed endlessly. Haley is a girl, but her father cannot see that, cannot accept it, because it's tough to see. So Haley finds other people to lean on, of course, which we all do when those who are near to us don't necessarily support us in the way we need. We find others to confide in. And one of those people that Haley confides in is her counselor, Mrs. D. Well, Mrs. D is a good listening ear and a shoulder to cry on, and a person who seems to get what Haley is going through. There's a connection. She is there when Haley needs her, and this is so important in a time when things are confusing and terrifying, isn't it? To have someone who's there to listen to what's happening. Mr. D really, or Mrs. D really cares about Haley. And as she hears Haley's story, as she shares how much she just hates her father and how he's stopping her from being who she is, and as Mrs. D watches the effects on the relationship, she becomes more and more concerned and involved. Well, at some point in the show, there is the inevitable crime. This is, after all, a crime show. One evening in his tow truck, Haley's dad is savagely beaten with a tire iron and is sent to the hospital. And here enters Detective Benson and Stabler, and they're on the case. And they weave their way through a variety of suspects, some more obvious, some more suspicious, including Haley, until finally, to their surprise, they discover that it was actually Mrs. D who did this. Well, fast forward to court, where Mrs. D explains that she couldn't sit by and watch Haley's father ruin this girl's life. Haley had tried to commit suicide several times, and at some point, the pain that Mrs. D was feeling from Haley was almost too much for her to hold. She just had to act, she describes. And so she decided to kill Haley's father, to protect Haley from him. Well, Haley's father does indeed suffer dearly, but he does not die. And he ends up sitting in that courtroom with all of this happening, hearing this as the trial goes on. And he's forced to listen, first to his daughter, that shares that she trusts Mrs. D and knows that Mrs. D loves her, but when she's asked if she feels the same about her father, she responds, I don't know. Haley is asked by the prosecutor, do you want your father dead or not? You say one thing and then you say another. I don't know, she responds. And all of this just hits him so hard. He sits and listens to the testimony of Mrs. D as she explains the things that Haley had been saying. And here's where the final twist in the plot comes. After an impassioned testimony, Mrs. D reveals that she was herself once a man. And she recalls the horrible abuse that she had done to her over time in school and as she grew older. And that included, as she got older, a castration. She reflects the horrible way things can go for Haley if love isn't there, if support isn't there, if her parents aren't with her in her midst. She so desperately needs it. Mrs. D stands in the middle of this whole crazy thing with her wounds for everyone to see. And Haley's dad sees those wounds. And it's in that moment that it clicks for him. Suddenly he sees that while he's grieving the loss of his son, the almost death of his son, right there in front of him at this moment, all along, is his daughter, Haley. But he couldn't see it. He was blind to it. He'd been trapped in the grief of losing his son and what he had hoped for and what he had thought possible in that relationship. And now there in front of him, right there in front of him, appears a daughter, someone who needs him just as much, and someone who he can hold and touch and care for. Haley's dad had, in a sense, locked himself away, both in his mind and how he saw things. And it takes Mrs. D, someone who knows pain, someone who to come through that door, that locked door, and stand in front of him so that he can see what reality really is like, and so that he can live fully into it. Well, in the end, the mother and the father and Haley, they walk out of the courtroom together into an unknown, but definitely more loving and supportive future. And so perhaps a better life for her than for Mrs. D. The second Sunday in Easter is all about being locked away, isn't it? We see the disciples there in that room. It's about a fear of those things that we don't understand and we can't control, and how much of the world is like that at this moment. It's about desperately needing Jesus to come and to just stand among us. We need Jesus to come with his wounds, for us to know that God knows the pain, open and bleeding for us to see, so that we can see the true reality of resurrection. That it isn't just death, that it's life. Like the disciples, Haley's dad is locked away. Like the disciples, Haley's dad has lost what he cares about the most. And it's never coming back, he thinks. Nothing's ever coming back. Henry is never coming back. For the disciples, Jesus, as they knew him, is never coming back, at least not in the same way, at least not the way they were before, sitting at Lazarus' table eating dinner. So what have you lost that you feel is not coming back? Henry is gone. He is no more. But Haley's dad can't see that the death of his son is the resurrection of his daughter. But Mrs. D, standing in their midst, helps him to see that because of those wounds. Maybe we need to see the wounds of Jesus to somehow know resurrection. And I'm not sure how it really works, but I know it happens. And I know that as humans we get lost in whatever is happening out there, the lost in perhaps death or the nothingness or the grief and the sorrow and the sickness and the viruses and the worry. And of course we lock ourselves away, and some of that is for safety, for others, for sure. But Jesus doesn't leave us there, does he? He doesn't leave us locked away. He doesn't leave Haley's dad there, and he doesn't leave Haley locked away in a boy's body, confused and wondering, God finds a way to transition her in, to resurrect into new life. And so Jesus comes into our midst so that we can know resurrection both in relationships between father and daughter and mother and son, resurrection in hope for the future that isn't ruled by what we're seeing right now. And this happens in all sorts of ways. In the Gospels, Jesus shows up to the disciples, he shows up to Thomas and then behind a locked door. For Mary Magdalene, he calls her name. He says, Mary, Mary. She sees him. She recognizes him and cries out for joy. And Jesus comes to us as we eat with Jesus, as Jesus nourishes us in bread and wine. Jesus shows up. And so sometimes Jesus' resurrection, it feels like an earthquake, shaking us to the core, just as Mrs. D shook Haley's dad right to the core, shook him until he rose from the deadly sleep that he had been in. And sometimes Jesus' resurrection happens when Jesus comes and stands among us, and with comfort and quiet words says, "Peace be with you." Peace be with you as you sit in your homes, scared and fearful. Peace be with you as you're grieving death of what was. Peace be with you as you're worried about tomorrow. Jesus shows up when you're afraid. Jesus calls your name this morning, calls out Amy and Joan and Grace and Robin and Kirk. Jesus is here, and where you are, in that bread and wine, standing among you in your own homes, saying, "Peace be with you." Jesus will always show up. And wherever Jesus is, there's resurrection. There's resurrection, and that, my friends, is everything for all of us who are locked away, is it not? Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. Alleluia. Amen.